All right, everybody, welcome to another Developer Livecast here on the channel. As always, I'm Josh Spicer, and we have another great Perceptive podcast for you today. We're going to be talking to another indie developer who is currently working on a modern retro RPG. We're going to be talking about not only the design of it, but also what it's like to be making a game that pretty much looks like something from over 30 years ago in today's market. So, please welcome from Scape IT, the developer behind Skald Against the Black Priory, Al, and I'll let him introduce his full name there.
Hey Josh, what's up?
I am doing well. How about you?
Fine as well. Really, really cool of you to have me on. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you for getting in touch with me about wanting to do this. And again, for any developers watching, we are always looking for new guests to come on and talk design. Because as everybody knows, we can certainly do that at length here. So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. It's Norwegian autumn outside, so it's starting to get a bit cold and wet. But that's the perfect climate for game development, I think. So everything's fine. It's been a busy week, when you try to balance having a day job with a pretty big project on the side. You have to keep your laser focus from day to day. But it's been going super fine so far. So happy days.
hmm We are in, I guess, like fall summer weather here, or summer fall right now, with all the seasons getting messed up here on the East Coast.
Yeah, exactly.
I am waiting for the cold, though. I am a cold person. I love the cold. I can't take the heat. So hopefully it will finally become winter at some point. Hopefully it just doesn't wait till like June next year to become winter.
Exactly. No, I think we're actually dipping into frost every night now, more or less. So it's getting cold up here in the northern Norway.
hmm What for people watching? What's the time zone difference right now?
Oh, I'm on GMT +2, which means that I'm actually 6 hours ahead of you, six
Okay,
hours ahead of EST.
all right. But yeah, we certainly have a lot to talk about. And for the chat joining us, if you have any questions about Scold, modern retro design, RPGs, anything like that, feel free to leave those comments and we'll get to them as they show up. But like I said a few minutes ago, it's a pleasure to have you on. So to begin with, since this is your first time on the cast out, could you talk a little bit about your background as well as what is Scold Against the Black Priory?
So I have, my educational background is mostly outside of IT, and I don't work in IT or game development at all in my day job. But I've been doing it on the side as a hobby for maybe 10 years now, and also doing some freelance development and coding. I really enjoy working in programming. I enjoy coding and enjoy making things. So years ago, I started to think about really going the full distance and actually publishing a game, and that's going to be Skald Against the Black Priory,
hmm
which is style 8-bit style RPG made obviously in a modern engine and for modern platforms. But it's heavily inspired by games such as the Magic Candle series, the early Ultima games, the Gold Box series. I grew up with myself and games that I really, really still enjoy playing. But I find I have for all of the really old games, so to make my own.
Yeah. So how long have you been working on Scold?
It's one of those projects where you on something and then it morphs into what it is today. So there's parts of Skald that's about maybe 2 years old, like the dialogue tree engine. I originally started to make it as more like a game book thing.
hmm
I wanted to just be able to make interactive fiction with it. But then I realized I needed some graphics, and then I realized I needed an overland map, and then I needed an inventory system, and so you just keep adding components to it, and then you start seeing the outline of what could feasibly become a pretty good tile turn-based low-res RPG. And that's sort of the fun part of working with RPGs. It's very modular. It lends itself very well to object-oriented programming, where you write component after component of the game, and you just puzzle it together until it becomes something that's really fun to work with. It's like building with bricks.
So I guess one thing to kind of clarify then. So with Skald, like, I've spoken to a few developers who worked on kind of like old school games. I'm trying to pull up a few of their names now while you were describing it. Like, is Skald being built with like an old school engine, or are you actually like using like a modern engine and kind of going for making it look like a classic game?
Yeah, that's it's the latter.
Okay.
Skald is I use Unity
Okay.
for most of the game, or for a part of the game. I use the draw pipeline, the render pipeline of Unity, and the cross compiler. But the Skald engine is written in C#, and it's pretty self-contained. It's just there is a small Unity wrapper around the engine, so it could ostensibly be run from another development from another environment that understands C#. But for now, I'm using Unity for the cross compiler. So there is, I mean, the look and the feel of Skald. It's an artistic choice, and it's a pragmatic choice as well, in a sense. Because working in low res, because I'm a solo developer, I'm the only one doing this. Even though I have some awesome freelancers, I'm pretty much on my own in this project. And so, if this game was going to get made, there is no way I could do it with high resolution graphics. It would cost too much and it would be too time consuming. So there's definitely something to be said for designing within constraints when working with a game like this. Absolutely. 16 colors, it makes it so much easier to animate. Even I can make tiles.
And I was just looking up, I spoke with Mark from 6502 Workshop, like on a recording cast, and he's making the game Nox Arceus, and that game is just literally being made on Apple II hardware, and then it's going to be ported to modern computers.
It's a whole other ball game. I'm really impressed with how hardcore you have to be to go all in on spending so much time making a game for an Apple II computer. That's really you have to really love it to do something like that. And I think Mark does. He's an awesome guy, and he's really interesting to talk to because he's so into it, and he has a lot of excellent insights in doing it. So I have to say I'm super lucky because I have a game I can sell on mobile platforms if I want to, and it's on the business side, it's a lot easier to work with a modern framework. But I have a lot of respect and really impressed with how Mark and his team is working.
Yeah. And when that recorded cast with Mark goes up, I think my programmer followers going to have a field day listening to him describe what it's like to be making a game on the Apple II.
Exactly. I don't do assembly programming myself, but I really want to get into it after getting to know Mark. He's so passionate about it, and he's so his enthusiasm is infectious, I think.
So getting back to Skald, so you said that you've been kind of working on and off for about 2 years. Is that right, or has it been longer?
Years, I think now. Yeah. The game is such that it could easily have another graphical expression than it does. It could be a dungeon crawler. It could be in 3D. It could have high resolution graphics, and also that's also part of the big strength of like the Skald project for me, because the engine is very reusable, either parts of it or all of it. So it's very easy to reskin to make another RPG that looks. Features, but that maybe looks completely different and plays different. So and that's also been why I've been going so all in on it, because pretty neat little pragmatic decisions built into the design of the project. Even though it's also very much a passion project for me. Really, I really love the game and I love working on it. But it feels easier to take so much time away from doing other things when you know that you have a project that could be that could it's not going to make me quit my day job, but I could definitely milk the project for years to come with different iterations of either the Skald franchise or doing something completely different with the engine. So that's really rewarding.
And as you said a few minutes ago, with this kind of RPG design, it is very much designed to be modular like that. If you want to make a new story or a new universe, you already have the engine kind of in place to kind
absolutely.
of do something else with it.
I've been really having the next project I'm going to do, whenever I do a hobby project with the Skald engine and not Skald against the Black Priory, is probably going to be a roguelike with the engine, just to see how it would play as a roguelike, because it has all the features of it, and with some tweaking, it probably could be just as well a pretty good roguelike. So that would be a fun little side project to do, just to engine a bit.
All right. So, in terms of the design of Skald, like, what kind of, like, I think you may have mentioned this a few minutes ago, what kind of RPGs, like, were, like, inspired you to make it?
I was a really, really big fan of the Magic Candle series, actually. That was a huge part of the inspiration for me. And oddly enough, did you play the series yourself?
No, the CRPG genre is one that I didn't quite get into back in the old days.
Okay, yeah. There's an obscure number 4 in the Magic Candle series. Is an obscure prequel called Bloodstone, and I played it to bits when I was younger. So that's a really happy childhood memory, and it looks a bit like Skald. You can definitely see a lot of the influences there. I also really enjoyed Wasteland 1. And the Bard Tale series, and there's a lot of that in there as well. Wasteland 1 is actually, if you reskin Skald to a post-apocalyptic game, the game it would feel the most similar to, if you look past the fantasy and the fantasy look of the game. So that was a big influence as well. I really like those Western RPGs. Those were big with me. I was never a fan of JRPGs, but Western RPGs was So and a lot of it shines through, I think, with Skald.
The old JRPG versus CRPG conversation. That's another hour we could add on to this cast easily.
Yeah, I don't think I'm touching it with a 10-foot pole. I think I'll disenfranchise some of my fans if I do. Fan, needless to say, I'm not.
So I guess you mentioned this earlier, but I know one of my followers, Draken, asked as well. Like, what inspired you to make Skald? Like, why? What kind of led you to making this game to begin with?
That's a good question. I think game development is it's become a hobby that I get for gaming. Enjoy doing game development. I think it's really fun to do. There's something with seeing the land rise from the water, so to speak. When everything comes together and it starts working, it's incredibly satisfying, and it's so multidisciplinary as well. Even if you do yourself, if you do the art yourself, it's really rewarding. And also if you get to work with some really, really awesome people, if you use freelancers or have partners who help you with art and music, that's also really, really fun. Seeing your vision come together. So it's that alone is reason enough to do game development. But I also think there's also an aspect of very rural part of Norway, and I think a hobby like gaming and game development, it's all you need is a computer. You can basically live in the forest or on the mountain somewhere, but you can still be part of this awesome network and do something that's environmental impact. There is no physical goods being shipped. Entertain someone for hundreds of hours, and think of all the joy and comfort it brings to people in a world that's kind of like, I think people need something to make them feel good, and I think games are pretty awesome at doing that.
I think at some point that may be where I move next, is like moving to the mountains somewhere away from civilization. I can do all my videos and interviews that way. No one will ever find me in real life.
Basically my whole motivation for doing game development.
Now, one question I always like to ask when we have international guests on: what is kind of like the state of like the indie game scene in Norway right now? Are there any like notable studios or other games people may have heard of?
I think probably the biggest Norwegian toast, but the biggest or most internationally known Norwegian game studio is Funcom. They
Okay.
did Age of Conan and World of Darkness, for
Hmm.
instance. They did a lot of MMOs, and there is definitely an indie scene in Norway as well. Called Alchemy Studios. They did Owlboy, if you played that. It was
Oh
a indie
yes.
platformer. So those were Norwegian. And there's a bunch of other Norwegian games as well. There is definitely a game scene in Norway, but Norway is kind of strange because in Norway, and so more games if you want to make a living in Norway because pay what they pay
Hmm.
without having Norwegian wages, and Norway is very expensive to live in terms of housing and everything. So it's difficult, I think, to as an indie game developer in Norway doing only game development.
Hmm.
You either have to diversify a bit or some uh, um, government projects to support. It's a very typically Norwegian thing that you have government support for.
Hmm.
So there are grants you can apply for and things like that. And I think that's definitely an important part of being a game developer in Norway. I think
Hmm.
it would be hard for people to do it full time without
Yeah.
some support, at least in a period of their startup. So Norway is a strange beast in that sense. And also, I get the impression I live out in the boonies myself, and I also get the impression that a lot of the game developer community in Norway is, I mean, like it's anywhere, it's centralized around the bigger cities in Norway, but
Hmm.
it is in Norway, so that means that there are only a few clusters where there's probably some activity.
Hmm.
So I think
Yeah.
Norway is definitely not in the forefront of game development or indie game development. It has ways to go, I think, but there are some really really talented people here, absolutely,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of potential. But
Yeah.
so, some things that makes the market hard to break into if you're a Norwegian,
Hmm.
especially, I would say.
Yeah. Like over here on the East Coast, like outside, like again, like the major areas like New York, like there really aren't like too many like notable game development scenes here. Like I've been keeping an eye out here in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and it's still very much like small times here. And
Exactly.
yeah, and I know with Canada, they also have, I think, a government fund or something for game developers or art. And yet, I don't think we have anything like that here in the U.S. That would be amazing if we get that at some point. But yeah, it's definitely hard, or it does feel like it's on the harder side. It when you're in kind of like a remote area. But like we were just saying, like the beauty at least of the independence or just game development is that thanks to the internet and what we're doing here with like virtual offices and cloud stuff, we can make games anywhere in the world now.
And I think that's kind of a I think that's a really fascinating thought because I don't just live outside of a town. I live in the Norwegian equivalent of northern Alaska, pretty
Hmm.
much in the Arctic part of Norway, and it's pretty far to the next big city. But still, there's still this idea that excellent for game development because housing costs are low, office
Hmm.
places are cheap, there are tax incentives for living in this part of Norway. You could definitely run a studio out somewhere like this because you don't necessarily need to be surrounded by as long as you get people to come and work in your studio, you don't need to have another studio
Hmm.
just across the street. That's not a prerequisite. You can do everything by internet and just have a few people in house to run your studio. So I think there's a huge potential for development or IT in general for rural areas. I think that's to
Hmm. Yeah.
explore further. Absolutely.
Hmm. And I guess getting back to kind of Skald's design and such, what what led you to making Skald? Like, is Skald like your first like full major game project? Or have you worked on smaller titles or other games before?
I've done a lot of smaller games on Game Jolt and things like that. Toy games, basically small free games. So this is definitely the first big project. But at the same time, I've been dabbling in game development for a long time, and I do some work in. I have background also. I do project management and things like that. So it's not really a big leap. There's a lot of moving pieces, but at the same time, I think if you keep your if you just stay focused and you avoid things like feature creep or overindulging in graphics and doing things like that, it's absolutely doable. And it's been a really, really interesting project so far. And I think I learned a lot from doing it. Both that it's been going much better than I dared hope so far, in terms of managing the project. But also there's a lot of things that you didn't think of before you start.
Yeah.
It's a big undertaking to do something like this, and especially to do it where you have a steady rate of progression, where you commit pretty much to a deadline. I've said that my deadline is my release date for devices is June, July of 2020. Keep that, but that means being really, really disciplined, and also being strict with how you prioritize both your time and the rate of feature implementation and because you have so much rope to hang yourself with doing something like this, and especially when you get Kickstarter money as well. It's really you have a loaded gun.
Yes. For sure with that.
Absolutely. So you really, really just need to take it one step at a time and just really think things through. But if you do, it's more manageable than you would think. My experience so far.
Yeah. And if we have time near the end, we'll talk more about the Kickstarter and kind of some of the work that went into that for one of our topics. But in terms of Skald's design itself, for people watching, what is the general gameplay going to be about?
So Skald is what we call a tile and turn-based RPG. This means that it's turn-based is a given, but the game world is divided up into tiles of 16 by 16 pixels, and you move one tile at a time, like the early Ultima games, for instance, and like most roguelikes, it looks a bit like that, and the low fidelity as well. It uses a 16 color palette, which is from the Commodore 64. So it looks, on the surface level, it looks a lot like an old Commodore 64 game, but it takes some liberty with how it uses the color. It does things that the Commodore couldn't. It has more colors for instance, per 8x8. I use any number of colors, whereas the Commodore 64 could only use one color, I think, per.
Okay.
Something like that. So there's absolutely some restrictions that I don't adhere to, but it's more of a retro clone maybe, or something like that. It's and so the game will see you travel across this pretty big game world. The game can get pretty big when you have when it's tile based, because it has such a small memory imprint. It's so easy to render, and you lead a party of between 1 and 6 characters across this pretty dark and grim fantasy game world. Hope for the game to be heavy, to have a lot of text in it, and these little choose your own adventure sequences and lots of dialogue, and be pretty reactive, I think. I hope so, and it's looking good so far, looking really good so far. Okay. So yeah,
I guess looking at the art for the game, with titles like this, especially with the whole modern retro feel to it, were there other aesthetics or other things you were thinking about with Skald, or did you know very much right away this kind of look you wanted for the game?
Both yes and no, because I very quickly landed on the tile-based design, and then it was a question of how big do you make the tiles, colors do you have, And I quickly realized that 16 by 16 is a very manageable tile size because that means that I could do a lot of the art myself,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually a big thing. It's a bigger thing than you would think because there are thousands of tiles in a game like
Yeah.
this. 32 by 32 pixels, they take 4 times as much big, and they take more than 4 times as long to make. Whereas when they're very small, they're a lot easier to make. And then it's also that also narrows it down, and you realize that if I have fewer colors, it makes it a lot easier to designer choose all the colors I want. It doesn't really look as good. And so then I looked through different color palettes, and I saw that the Commodore 64 definitely it struck a chord with me because I used to play games that looked like that, and things sort of played out by itself from there because then you have some feeds back into the retro look, and everything came together very well when I realized that the Commodore 64 palette was the palette to go for with this game. But it's like I said earlier, it's purely an artistic choice. I could have used any number of colors or any kind of resolution if I wanted to, but for me that it really spiked my creativity at least, and fans reacted to it very well. I was very active on Twitter at the time, and you sort of you quickly get a feel for work when you post it on Twitter. That's really one of the social media, get instant feedback.
Yep.
And people really reacted well to it, and that made me think I was on the right track. And obviously I was, because the Kickstarter was a huge success and people are very enthusiastic for the game. So I found a lot of love in the Ultimate community, which is still surprisingly really, really awesome community. And yeah.
Yeah, and we certainly know when it comes to CRPG design, there are a lot of old school fans out there, and we definitely saw this with many of the Kickstarter projects that came out over this decade. What was it? I think Pillars of Eternity was one. Wasteland got a reboot or another sequel. And I'm sure for the audience watching, you guys probably know more than I do of some of the other major Kickstarter projects.
Josh Sawyer from Obsidian Studio, they made Pillars of Eternity,
Yep.
among others. I think he has a very good quote where he said that the publishers, no, sorry, the audience didn't abandon the isometric RPGs, but the publishers did.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for a lot of genres. I think they were
Yes.
left behind by technology, but not necessarily by the gamers. So I think that leaves a lot of design space for
The
young developers.
the survival horror genre is right now crying in the corner as we're talking about this.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I think the same goes actually for tile-based RPGs, because there is things about playing. I know you're a huge roguelike fan, and I think there's a lot of the same things with tile-based RPGs as well, because it's a game that you can do a few moves. You can have the game running besides doing something else. The game doesn't advance until you do. There's kind of this Zen-like thing with just one more move. I think everything through really, really appeals to a lot of people. It really appeals to me. And so that was a huge part of why I decided to do this genre, because I really, really wanted to play a game like that. And I realized that there were very few games being made that I wanted to play. Roguelikes have been almost bigger than the classical CRPG genre in the tile niche. But finding RPGs that are like that, where you have like tile and turn-based movement, it's from the last years, it's not so common, I think, at least less than you would think.
Yeah, and again, like we've seen so many roguelites, likes, any other examples you can think of that just kind of like blew up, whether they're using modern graphics or again the old school tile based or just pixelated graphics. Uh oh.
Okay.
I think I lost your
Sort of.
sound. Oh, Can you still hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, you're starting to break up a little bit. We're getting like some latency, I think.
Should we try to good connection? I can see.
Let's see. I can't check from here. Let's see if it stays. It may just be a little hiccup.
Sure,
All right.
sure.
Yeah. And for the audience watching, if it starts to get too bad, let me know, and we'll switch things over, and we'll just have an image for Owl there. But
Yeah.
getting back to the topic, yeah, like, and I think this will actually be a good segue into talking more about kind of like modern retro design as well. Like with Skald, as we were talking about this before the cast, and I think on our messages, that again, when you look at Skald, it looks very much like a game from the 8-bit era, Commodore 64, etc. But
Yeah.
there's definitely that challenge of making something that, yes, it looks and emulates that feel, but it should still be playable to modern audiences. And that
Absolutely.
is definitely like that very tough line for a lot of developers to get around. So, with Skald in particular, like, I guess, have you done anything in terms of, I guess, modern day elements or playability or anything like that to make it appealing to somebody who hasn't grown up playing those games? Or like, have you done like any research on that end?
Yeah, I have. And the way I work with Scald now is that I've had a pretty extensive going on now for a few weeks with backers from the Kickstarter and followers on the Discord, which has so they are giving me feedback while I work. I have my own background as a CRPG player that sort of informs because I'm making a game that I would like to play,
Mm-hmm.
and so I try to communicate a lot with both with the community and the game has been it's been tested, but a lot of people they don't share their game until they're far down the process,
Mm-hmm.
but I haven't had that kind of process with Skald, so I keep getting feedback all the time, and I really, really try to look for things that where's the friction in the game, where's the things that will make people not want to play the game, because you really, really have to think about it today. And I think one of the big differences now versus 30 years ago is that you have to be a lot more respectful of people's time. I think you could have these. Not allowing people to save where and whenever they wanted to, or having things that having much more grind in the game, having big, very trashy dungeons that would make just to pad the runtime of the game. And I think that's really, really off-putting to a lot of
Mm-hmm.
because people might want to sit down and play the game for 20 minutes, and that might be all the time they have. And that's really, really, a point of feedback I've been getting. But at the same time, there's also a game that's going to look like it was made 30 years ago. So there is a limit to how far I will go.
Mm-hmm.
Every conceivable modern convenience in terms of UI, for instance. And so it's this sorting almost where you have to consider: am I throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Experience of playing an old game, or is this what's the cost benefit of cutting this feature or modernizing this feature? Auto mapping is a big thing in
Mm.
CRPGs. A lot of
Oh
CRPGs
yes.
didn't auto map for you, so you had to map
Mm.
yourself. I have automap because that's the exact kind of feature where most people don't have time to sit and draw their own maps. But there are some people who really like that, and who's actually been like, yeah, is it possible to turn off that feature in the game?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect example of weighing. Okay, is automapping, is that in a, or will you alienate more people by cutting it? It's a really interesting design challenge, but it's been really, really fun so far. I'm glad I have the community I have. They
Yeah.
offer a lot of.
And like that, like right in of itself is a very like interesting challenge, and it goes with that very tough conversation around modern retro design. Because as you're running into, and I'm sure as the other developers I've spoken to have also, that there's that fine line between I want to make a game that is from, the NES era or the Apple
Yeah,
II or anything like that, but conversely, I need to think about if I want this game to sell, if I want to reach an audience, like, do I have modern conveniences? Do I change this design? And if so, how far do I go before it's not even, the same game or that style that I wanted to make in the first place?
exactly. That's a really, really interesting question. And I think a lot of people take far too lightly. A lot of people who try to make retro games, they take far too lightly on that, and they're to modern conveniences, and it ends up being sort of, because when you're making a retro game, having a classically designed chair or an old car or something like that. If you suddenly if you have a beautiful old car from the 50s, but then you put a modern GPS in it, and people pick up on it, and the consumers pick up on it, even if they're not really able to put the finger on it, they do pick up on it. And like also a big red flag for me is when people try to make retro RPGs or retro games of any kind, and they have a very pixelated graphics, but then there's an element on the screen that's higher resolution. Would indicate that should be possible, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
That really, really annoys me, because and I think it annoys a lot of it annoys consumers as well, and they might not even realize why, but it looks sloppy. And the same goes for feature design. I think it really, really goes for that as well. People will pick up on things like that.
Yeah,
and
like, that's something that I've noticed a lot over this decade, playing a lot of games while my voice is about to go. Sorry about that. But it's something that I've picked up as well when playing a lot of modern retro design games from developers where, in a way, it feels worse than the games that they were trying to emulate in the first case. Like, if I, Shark mentioned this earlier about how I play a lot of platformers, and I have played a whole mess of indie 2D platformers in the last 9 years. And if I play a game that you designed in 2018 or 2019 that's supposed to emulate a game from 1991, and it plays worse than those games, then it's like, something is not connecting here. We're trying to, the connection's not being made. And
exactly,
it is tough like that when we're talking about these games, because, as you said, like, there are developers out there that when we say modern retro, they will, adhere to it almost 100%. I'm going to have screen flickering. I'm going to purposely have
exactly.
enemies, just spawning endlessly. Like, there's no real attempt or even no real concessions made for trying to have elements from today or making things more appealing. And like we said, it's a tough decision to make. Because on one hand, they are making a game from 1989 or 1991, but do a lot of people want to play a game from that era? Warts and all.
Yeah, that's the question. And of course, it has an impact on the. Definitely makes it a niche product, and my game is absolutely a niche product. But I think it has the potential to attract a bit of a larger audience. But my core audience is definitely in this kind of game, and I think one of the strange things is actually that a game like I had this in mind when I designed Skald. It's really, really well suited, I think, for this. I used to play a lot of Gurk. Did you play Gurk on?
No, I did not.
It looks like version of Skald almost. I would say, but it's a really fun little game where it's a tile-based RPG, and it plays so well on the Android or on your phone, because you can pick it up while you're sitting on the bus, and you can play a few moves, and then you can pick. So playing games like that on my smart devices. And even though Skald is definitely being developed for PC or for desktop devices, I'm absolutely going to port it to handheld devices as well. And I think that's just a huge upside of working within that genre, because by accident it plays well on phones as well or
Yeah.
tablets. Yeah. So, but yeah, getting back to your to the original discussion about feature design in games like this, it's a tricky thing. It definitely is, and I think it also, you could say that in some cases it might add some restrictions on your business model for the game as well. Uh, I think if you do things like add things like in-app purchases, that would also be dissonant for players of games like this. I think people who buy games like this, they really prefer to buy the game in one go, pay for it, have it delivered, and then not having to pay more for it. And that might not necessarily make me any more money, but at the same time, I think it really it improves confidence in the brand
I
in some
am
sense. So it's also a balancing act, I think.
I am just waiting for a modern retro game to be released that has loot boxes in it. 8-bit resolution loot box scenes in a game. I don't know. That would be amazing or just depressing to see.
It would be so easy to add loot boxes to Skald. It's ridiculous. But I think it would also. I would have no more users on my Discord tomorrow if I did. So yeah, so you have to keep it at arm's length. But I think also, I'm never going to do things like that to this project at least. But I would definitely be more willing to look into different business models when I launch the game on handheld devices and phones. I could definitely do something like publish the game for free and then have advertisement in it or something like that. But for laptops or for desktop devices, the experience has to be the experience of playing a game 30 years ago, I think. Yeah. And then the sort of the fact that you can get it on the phone as well, that's supplementary to that experience. But the experience is buying the game, installing the game, and playing the game on your computer. That's sort of a core design pillar of the Skald project, I think, for me. So that's interesting as well. And I don't know why I feel that way, but I think I would definitely take more allowances with the iPhone port, for instance, than with the desktop version.
Okay. And I think some of my favorite examples of kind of like modern retro games would be those that kind of, again, I think they go like the best of both worlds. It's one part the retro design, but they do have modern elements or maybe a little bit more have those concessions, such as Yacht Club games, Joy Mashers, Joy Masher, Locomalito is a really good example as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
that's a great example.
And I think like those kinds of games work the best because it's not only just like a high quality classic game, but it can still be enjoyed by a modern audience.
Absolutely. And that's what's interesting with going back and revisiting games that you enjoyed while you were younger. It's realizing how much good design went into a lot of those games. I think that's sort of the problem with some developers when they try to make retro remakes. They take it as a carte blanche that if the graphics look old-fashioned, then we don't really have to have good gameplay as well. We can take allowances with the game, and that's not really the case at all. I think it makes it more important to really design the game well, and I think it shows in games like, for instance, Locomalito, I think, which is a pretty good game, and it has, I wouldn't say that it has retro graphics maybe, but still, that's interesting. It's interesting to sort of dissect games that you used to love when you were younger and look into what made this game good. Why was this game so good? What's the genius behind this game? Yeah. And there's a lot of wisdom to take away from that, I think, in modern game development as well.
For sure. And again, especially when you're designing a game around this kind of modern retro design, that you're not dealing with a lot of, I guess, the fluff or fat in a AAA game. Like, you don't have fully animated cutscenes. You don't have, post-content support or crazy DLC and things like that. You really need to give a very pure experience that somebody's going to enjoy. And it's even
Absolutely.
harder by the fact that when you're dealing with something that's retro like this, someone's going to look at it right away. And if you don't get them quickly, they're just going to think, oh, why should I play this game? I have all these other titles I can go to.
It comes down to things like having rewarding game loops, and
Mm-hmm.
things that isn't really, that has to do with the satisfaction of playing the game. Because how do you make someone play a game that looks like 30 years ago in 1919, and you make them play the game for 100 hours? How do you it's a tall task, I think, but it's doable. Absolutely, I think so. So but it's a really, really interesting, and I'm absolutely not saying that I'm going to hit that mark with Skald, but I would really like to. It's a journey towards that goal. I would say that maybe the sequel will make it, or maybe the third game down the line. Um, role playing games are an interesting beast because they have this really, really satisfying built into it. So you get a lot for free role playing games, I think. And you just have to leverage that in a way that makes it interesting to keep playing it for a long time, either by adding scripted story content or making interesting game systems or an interesting setting with some environmental storytelling that really makes people want to keep exploring it. Replay value somehow by maybe having different character builds. It's rewarding, I think, with the RPG genre. I'm lucky to work in that genre. It's very fun too if you
Yeah.
love RPGs.
Mm-hmm. And by getting back, or with more about this kind of modern retro design and the modern retro market, like, excuse me, that I think, as we said, like a lot of people assume that this is easy, or that this is quote unquote easier than designing a game for modern audiences. And I don't think I would necessarily agree with that. As we said, there are a lot of poor examples of modern retro games. And it seems like there's a lot more work that goes into this market than I think a lot of people realize.
Why would it be? I mean, when you think about it analytically, why would it be easier? Because in terms of game experience or player experience, what goes on under the hood is the same, no matter how the graphics look. If you took a game that's Warcraft and you replaced the 3D models with 2D models, it would still have the same addictive game loop built into it, I think, and it would take the same amount of design to make something like that appealing. And there is no, or to put it in another way, there's no limit to how much craft and intelligence and analysis you can put into making your game as good as possible, no matter how simple the game is. And by all means, a game like Skald, it looks simple, but it's not it's a very complex beast.
Mm-hmm.
It is.
Yeah.
So I don't really think it's easier to design a game like this. Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
There's
And
a,
I guess this is kind of a preview when I had my podcast with Mark up. But one thing that I really liked, or one good takeaway that he had about designing a game for Nox Arcades for the Apple II, was that in terms of looking at modern features or modern concessions, he basically came to this idea of what could be the iteration of this genre if people were still making games on that platform. And
absolutely.
that's kind of like where he took his design, so that while it is definitely a classic game, he's still thinking about kind of like, I guess it's kind of like a retro future kind of take on that genre. And I thought that was
Absolutely.
really fascinating in terms of its design.
Yeah, yeah, he puts it very well when he says it like that, because it's sort of an extrapolation of what would Apple II games look like if we were still using Apple IIs,
Mm-hmm.
and that's true. And he has that's sort of one of the luxuries on working with the original hardware, because you get a lot of there's a lot of I would say doing it on actual hardware. That's one of the things I have to be a bit careful with when since I'm working with a very modern engine, because there's no limit to what you could put into this game. It's not really a challenge. The challenge is holding back in a way that that makes the game seem legit without seeming like it's pandering too much to nostalgia, if you understand. So it's a different balancing act. But that's a really, really interesting way of thinking about retro game, the modern retro game design. Really, really interesting.
And keeping with the modern retro discussion, BDR in chat asked about how the audience who plays the type of game he makes finds his stuff, and he kind of feels like retro is too broad and not really niche anymore. So I guess, what do you think about that? I guess in terms of like kind of like the appeal of retro games these days.
Part of that question remains a lot of people who play the game at this stage is people who backed on the Kickstarter, are people who played games that looked like this 20 and 30 years ago. So for them, I think it has a lot of appeal, because it feels like, that's kind of like I would say my basic design pillar is that the way the game plays is the way we have a romanticized idea of how these games they were a bit rougher around the edges than this game is, but we don't remember that. We remember it as really, really well, and the graphics being a lot more rich than they actually were. And that's kind of the thing I'm trying to emulate with this game. I'm trying to emulate your rosy memory of how it used to feel to play games like this in the early 90s. And so I think that strikes a chord with people who used to play the game back in the day. I'm yet to release the game to a broader audience who didn't play games back then. And so I think it will be interesting to see if it has any appeal at all, or any penetration at all in the market of younger gamers, for instance. Understanding with to keep true to the genre, that there is a lot of you would say we're horribly outdated in terms of, for instance, UI, things like that today, because we've come so far in understanding what makes for a good user experience. And though I try to incorporate as much as possible of it, there are some things that I also feel stylistically should be the way they were. And people have I think people have been very understanding so far, and really enjoyed. I've been getting very good feedback, I would have to say, honestly, so far. And that's it's dangerous to get too comfortable with that, and the game still needs a lot of polish. But people have been very positive so far, and it's been I'm really glad I showed people the game as early as I did. Interestingly, few people have, or actually I don't think I've gotten a single comment from a playtester so far that's been sort of put off by how old-fashioned the game is.
Yeah, and I think. Oh, go ahead.
I think there's. I spent a lot of time cutting out things that had you end up a lot, or going through menus a lot. There's a lot of very small things that really makes the game flow a lot quicker. A lot of the UI is contextual, so the moment you have something to interact with, you get the prompt to interact with that thing. You don't have to, with the older games, you had to try and talk to it, you had to try and pick it up, you had to try and open it, and you have to like go through all the objects in the scene and do things like that. And that really slowed down gameplay, especially game. And there was a lot of memorizing what the different keys did on the keyboard. I removed all of that from the game. If you walk up to a cat, we'll say pet, and you can press the button and you will pet the cat. It's and that's kind of a modern design thing, but it's you don't really notice that it's there if you don't think about it, but it really simplifies gameplay and the flow of the game a lot, I think. And that's sort of the thing. It's allowing the player to make interesting decisions. Don't let there be too much time between each time the player makes interesting decisions in the game. That really makes for a good role-playing game, I think. And it doesn't have to be a big decision, but it should be, okay, here's something, should I interact with it? And then you shouldn't have to be able to, you shouldn't be required to spend time looking through all the key combinations on your keyboard trying to find out how to interact with that object, for instance.
And I think that is a really good point, again, about trying to balance that line between making a modern retro game and also trying to make something that's appealing. Because as you said a minute ago, like, a lot of people remember the good retro games, but there's a lot of bad back then. For my audience, when we do our retro nights, you've seen me play games like Friday the 13th and Jaws and so many third-party movie licensed platformers for the SNES and things like that. And a lot of these games do not hold up well. And I'm sure the same can be said of a lot of the older school CRPGs and even PC games as well. And I'm sorry?
No, just continue. I'm sorry, okay. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
And it is hard, like we've said, when you're designing this retro game, or even just any game in general, to figure out, does this option add depth to my game, or am I just making it needlessly complicated? And there are a lot of people who have trouble squaring the circle of those two things. There are people there who think that difficulty is automatically the sign of greatness. And it most certainly is not. But it's, as you said, like, giving the player depth, giving them choices that, make them feel like they're doing something is a big part of that. Having to, look at your keyboard to figure out what key opens up my inventory is not an example of a good choice there.
I think you have to remember that a lot of the older games, and that's probably just as true today, but you would add padding and filling longer, and I think especially with old RPGs, if you play them, you'd be surprised at how much there is to it. And I think and also I think there's a clumsy user experience almost by design sometimes, that it's almost part of the puzzle that you have to try and interact with every object in every conceivable way to try and find. It's there to pad the runtime of the game, I think. And I've said that I want my game to be, I want the player to be able to finish my game in an hour or two if they want to, but them to want to play the game for, if you understand. That, I think, is a more modern approach to designing, especially a role-playing game in a big open world. Have that where you can basically walk up to the final boss and just finish the game almost instantly if you want to. And if that's how you want to play the game, that's super fine by me. I don't want to force the player to spend 200 hours grinding in the game just to finish it. And what you said about how a lot of older games are really picked back up. I've been replaying a lot of old CRPGs. I'm going to catch some flack for this probably, but let's just do it. But I've been replaying a lot of old CRPGs, even those that really strongly inspired Skald. So many of those games, even though I played them a lot when I was younger, I can't get into them anymore for the life of me. I really don't have the patience to sit there and memorize the keyboard. Hard to get back into. So
And I think, as kind of a tangent, but I think it's related, we could even bring up kind of the rise and the change in the adventure game genre as well over the last 20 years. During, many people know the adventure genre as kind of the golden age of the late 80s and the 90s. And then, as more developers try to copy and emulate that style in the early thousands, it just became a confusing mess for anyone but the super hardcore, the puzzle solving people.
And the moon logic puzzles.
Yes. And then really didn't see until maybe like this past decade, maybe a little bit longer than that, as developers are trying to again figure out that balance between making a great puzzle game but also a great kind of story and narrative. Like one of my favorites would be a Wadget Eye with the Blackwell series, Unavowed, and so on. And again, like it's very hard, I think, or it's a very much a big challenge to figure out, what did I like about these games, and what do I never want to see ever again in this
Exactly.
genre.
And then also that opens the question: if you are a designer, why was it in here originally? And what will be the consequence of taking it out of the game? And that's something you have to, keep asking yourself time and time again, because, and that adds a lot of insight. That's kind of part of the archaeology or the sociology of looking back at older games and trying to replicate what made them great, but not much else. And I really agree. Puzzle games, that's a really good example of that exact thing. Where you had these really, really insane moon logic puzzles that drove people insane back in the day. And maybe a baby you'd want to throw out with the bathwater, I think.
And BDR asks in chat, did you look at new popular CRPGs like Pillars of Eternity as kind of inspiration, or did you take anything from kind of the modern market with designing Skald?
Absolutely, I did. There is a lot. There is a lot of modern RPG design in the game, or at least I would say at this point, the engine has been designed to allow for a lot of modern RPG design aspects in the Skald project. Because the game isn't finished yet, so I can't say what's in it yet. But the engine has been designed with that in mind. And one of the big things has been the way that in old RPGs, you used to have, especially the ones that Skald looked like, you usually had keyword-based dialogue where you had to ask every NPC name, job, they will tell you their job, and so forth. And then you had dialogue trees. Surprisingly long time, dialogue trees were very uninteractive in it's like the early Baldur's Gate 1, for instance. It was just a dumb graph that you would navigate through, and you would end up. At least apparently there was very little scripting in it and so forth. But I think the modern games, like the modern remakes of the isometric RPG genres, like Pillars of Eternity, they do a lot of interesting things with the way they use the dialogue tree and the way the dialogue has a lot. It's not stateless anymore. It looks at your background, it looks at your personality, and the way you make choices. Character develops very directly in the dialogue tree. I think that's something that I really want to at least have the ability to emulate in Skald. So a powerful scripting system, although the game engine the game logic can be accessed from scripts embedded in the dialogue of the game. So and that's not, it's not a revolutionary feature at all. It's not a big technical achievement, but there's a surprisingly big amount of games that don't do that. And I think that's really, really something that needs to be in an RPG. To this, that's something I really, really enjoy with playing the Obsidian games. Fallout New Vegas did it, which is also by Obsidian Studios, and I really, really enjoy that. And so that's one of the things that I've sort of stolen from modern RPGs. And the same thing is actually the thing with the sort of the choose your own adventure sequences. Things that they did in Pillars of Eternity, which is surprising how few people have done it before, because it's been many, many years since text started to be many years we've been able to include an insane amount of text in a game. Really reacted well, really positively to like the choose your own adventure sequences in Pillars of Eternity, and it's in retrospect, it's strange that it for so many years. It's strange that that's not part of the RPG genre the way we think of it, because it really isn't, I would say. And I think it has something to do with the value of written words contra moving pictures. Discussion we had that publishers abandoned the features, but players never wanted to. Players would have loved it, I think, but it doesn't look sexy enough. But it really works well. I think it's.
And Oscar and Chaz asking about, why don't we see more choose your own adventure book style games? And yeah, like again, it's one of those very weird things when you talk about these kinds of designs that like nobody makes them until somebody just flat out says, you know what, I'm going to do it myself. And then what usually happens is then everybody starts copying that game when they see how well it did. Stardew Valley probably being one of the big examples of this decade of developers saying, I want a Harvest Moon style game for my computer. I made it, and now we're seeing all these other kind of farming sim and games like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but yeah, like the RPG genre, I think is a very interesting one when you're trying to design it, because there are so many of them that focus more on the storytelling side rather than on interesting game mechanics. And then there are those who go vice versa, very generic story, but then they can create crazy systems. Like the Final Fantasy series have tried to, skirt that or walk between that line many times. And it's always hard, I think, to know just, what does the audience want for these games? And again, that even goes back to what we were just saying with, what kind of elements do you want to keep from classic games, and when do you want to throw them out in favor of something new and modern?
And I think that's a really interesting discussion. G design, which is sort of this spectrum that goes from RPGs to more narrative-based, sandboxy open worlds, and on the other hand, you have these very linear RPGs, and that's a really interesting discussion. I think it really ties back into also the JRPG versus CRPG distinction, because I think one is definitely more prevalent in genre has its own preference. So for Skald, I really wanted to have absolutely a big systemic game. You can't overlay a lot of narrative onto it, and that's also an interesting point, because he asked about the game books. One of the reasons that I think game books become a lot more popular now, who have made a lot of money selling them on handheld devices, they're really well suited for that. But still, it's not a huge genre, and part of the reason is that when you make a game book, a branching tree, most the simplest kind of implementation, the size of the tree grows exponentially the deeper it goes. So you end up having a lot of content that doesn't get showed on each playthrough. And so if you have only just like a stateless tree that you move through, that's not really a very resource effective way of making a game. So for me, at least, that's also part of the reason why I abandoned, because like I said, I started out making a game book, but that's a huge part of why I abandoned the game book. It's that I realized that if you lace the game book with some other systemic elements, a map that you can freely move around on, and things like that, characters that aren't stateless, that remember things about you, that belong to a faction that you can affect by interacting with the character and so forth, then it makes it a lot easier to use the content that you create for the game book, because you can have the game book do different things than letting you choose left or right. It can ask itself, okay, you choose left, but here you'll meet some characters. What's your relationship to those characters depending on your actions earlier in the game? So I think it's and that's the things that's so strange with me, because to me that sounds like something that should be more prevalent from earlier on, but it isn't, strangely, in a lot of games. So
and like like with this, like again, like the game book and the different choices is definitely a really good topic. And as you're talking
Mm.
about earlier in the cast with roguelikes in general, like that's another genre that also runs into that problem. That if your
Mm.
game doesn't have enough variance in it, then somebody's going to get bored and tired of it very quickly. But
Yeah,
if you kind of backload so much of it, most people may not even see all the variety. They may just see, oh, I play the game, I beat it, it's done, and then there's nothing else to it. But you could have had multiple events, multiple situations that can show up in it, and it's very
yeah.
hard to kind of convey, I guess, that kind of depth in these games, and especially when we talk about modern retro design. Like
Mm.
again, there are people out there like myself who love these old school games. Like again, I've played All Was Awakening, old stuff by Joy Masher, Loco Molito, etc. And then there are
Mm.
people who look at these games, and the second they see like pixel graphics, they go, "This is some dumbed down game. I don't care.
Yeah,
Give me Call of Duty or Mass Effect or anything like that. Give me a game that
exactly.
has like a $3 million budget at minimum, kind of thing."
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
No, I don't think I've seen a game called Cube World. Although there is a possible I may have played it and never and don't remember it these days. I've played way too many. Yeah. Like for myself, again, getting back to the whole CRPG, JRPG thing, I've just never been a fan of like open world style RPGs. Like again, like the Elder Scrolls series just never clicked for me. But I think part of that was
Really.
I grew up playing JRPG, so I'm basically the opposite of you. I played the Final Fantasies, Chrono Trigger, so many weird and niche games like that. That it's more about the systems than it is about this, branching narrative and stuff like that. But even that genre has definitely seen a lot of upheaval over these past 10, 15 years. Like I know they're still making like the Dragon Quest series, and like there are people who love that, and I just don't have any interest in playing them these days. Because I,
Really.
I just don't have the time really to play like an 80 to 100 hour long game like that.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's part of the charm, I would
Hmm.
say, with those games. If you're into it, it's that they're really long and you can really just lose yourself in
Hmm.
them. And um, but at the same time, and I think at least at some point, I think JRPGs and the kind of CRPGs that I tend towards, they're really, really different. They're in fact so different that it's almost unfair to compare them, I think, because the experience of playing them is really, really different, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, the parts of your brain that it appeals to, it's not the same for for those games. It's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, and as one other tangent, when we talk about modern retro games, we would definitely be doing a disservice if we didn't mention, of course, Jeff Vogue of Spireweb Software, who's basically made his entire career on games from like 1993, 1994, and that aesthetic.
really, I can't understate how big of an influence
Hmm.
Jeff Vogel's career has been on me. It's really part of the reason why I chose to go with this genre. And there's a lot of aspects of my business model that is really
Hmm.
developed from listening to Jeff Vogel talk about the way he runs his company.
Yeah.
Being ultra lean,
Hmm.
and yeah, he has a philosophy that I think he's also a great guy to listen to. So I mean, if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't heard about Jeff Vogel, you have some
Yeah, I did an
every
interview with him last month, just before Queen's Wish came up, and yeah, like he is just hilariously insane to talk to. Some of the topics we came up with for that cast. Uh oh. I think Al has frozen. Oh, are you still there? Uh oh. We'll see when we get him back. But here's the link to the Kickstarter, Mojo.
Hello?
Yep. Are you still there? Oh,
Yeah, I'm still here. It's not game wisdom if we don't have at least one dropout.
yeah.
Oh, I'm
Um.
back. Yeah, I lost you after Queen's Wish. After Queen's Wish.
All right. Not a problem. Let me to make things easier. I'll just use the image for Skald there. Let me just move things around because it may
Yeah,
just be the bandwidth may not be able to handle it.
absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
But yeah, like we did a whole podcast with Jeff Vogel just before Queen's Wish came out, and that was just hilarious to talk to him about topics and design.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
He's the grumpy old uncle of game design.
Oh
It's
yeah, we
really
said that. We came up with the idea that we just have a cast of him ranting for an hour. I don't even need to say a word. Just have him rant about being an old developer. I just do that like for every developer who comes on. Just like give you, I just get up and leave. You just rant for an hour about whatever the heck you want.
Yeah, exactly. I think I would listen to Jeff Vogel rant for an hour about being old and grumpy.
Hmm.
That sounds like an amazing podcast.
Hmm.
Fridays with Uncle Jeff.
There we go. Exactly.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, but I think he kind of he's kind of tongue in cheek with a lot of the things he says, but there's really, really a lot of wisdom in.
Hmm.
You really should lend an ear to Jeff Vogel, especially if you're a new developer
Yep.
and you're considering making a career in game development, and at least if your entryway is as an indie game developer, because it's a really, really, really tough business to try and make it in, and
Oh
most
yeah.
of people who try don't make it. But I think you can if you do a lot of what Jeff has done. He's really, really, the compromise between pursuing something that you making something you really like to make. At least he used to like making it, and uh,
Hmm.
and just like making a product that has the longest tail possible. I think that's really the big takeaway from listening to Jeff, for me at least. That these games, they are, at least role-playing games like this, they're kind of timeless in their design.
Yeah.
People are playing them today because they don't really care about the graphics that much, and
Hmm.
they really want a gameplay that's like that. And people will buy this game in 10 years as well
Hmm.
if it's popular. So yeah, no, but anyway, Jeff Vogel, interesting guy, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, going back to Skald in terms of like its design development for a few minutes, and also as a quick time check, we are just over an hour and 20 into the cast. So
Yeah,
we did set kind of a soft stop for around 2 hours. I Chances are we may be coming close to that, but are you still good on time?
no problem. Just go ahead.
Okay. Getting back to like with Skald, I guess one thing I'm curious about. I'm sure people watching this as well. In terms of kind of developing the game, were there any like interesting challenges or trouble spots that you had to work around with that people may not really realize, just by looking at the game?
Yeah, I think, yeah, obviously I think that's part of being a developer. You have that's a constant uh, with developing software in general, I think. But one of the issues with working with, for instance, the Unity engine is that the Unity engine it's not really made for making 2D games. So you have to, like I said with Skald, I pretty much wrote my own engine and draw pipeline
Hmm.
and sort of just use Unity for the final 10% of it. But it has for instance a fairly big memory impact. It can have, at least. That's something you have to work around if you want to port the game to Android. I've at least had to work around it. I was a bit unprepared for how clunky the game can become quite quickly because of the overhead with using Unity. And there's probably some technical things I could do with Unity. There's probably Unity developers pulling their hair out now
Hmm.
because they realize that this is just growing pains for me. But I've had to polish a lot of rough edges off for doing that. And I think also the art is very low resolution. and obviously a lot of this art is only placeholder, but you know, there is a lot of work that goes into art direction and having art that looks there is going to be a lot of work going into the art direction and having art that looks good all across the game, and that sort of conveys the feel of the game in a way that makes it interesting to continue playing for a long time. And sort of the environmental storytelling, it changes a bit when you only have 16 by 16 pixels per tile, you know.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot more thought than you would think. I think people think that making a game like this is just throwing together some models, but it takes a lot more work than you would think. I don't know, is it more on the technical side you're thinking, or more like the design aspects?
I would say either, really.
Yeah, I know. I would say also in an RPG like this, I have an ambition of making like the combat in the game interesting, and the balancing that goes into making a combat system. It's a never ending. It never stops. Making dozens of spells, dozens of feats. How should they interact together? I have this idea of having I play a lot of collectible card games, and I really love the idea of pre-decision randomness, being dealt the hand of cards and then having to form a tactic based on on the cards you're being dealt. So there's a lot going on in Skald where there's a lot of potential for interaction between the characters and synergies, and you have to look at, okay, who am I fighting? How's the initiative order? Okay, if I use this feat first and then this. But with that kind of design, there is a lot of room for shooting yourself in the foot with making, very destructive or very dominant strategies that keep playing out. So the balancing is part of the design, to be honest.
Yeah. And yeah, like RPG design, let me see, that's like another hour and a half of a discussion we can have. And it is very hard, I feel, to balance an RPG right. It is a topic that... I'm sorry?
Yeah, I think so, too.
Like, as you said, like, it's very easy to just throw all these crazy spells and powers and all that in the game, and then not really care about balance, and then realize that, 75 of the things I put in this game don't work. And maybe 2 of them are just so game-breaking that there's just nothing else. Like, why should I just do anything about it, really?
Yeah. Exactly, and there are so many RPGs, especially older RPGs, where you settle on a strategy very quickly in combat. You cast the same spell every combat. You have the same character move forward with melee. The other hangs back and shoots arrows. It's the same every combat. Yep. You make no change depending on what enemies you're fighting. There's just one strategy that you can just go all in on, and it will win the game for you every time. And I don't think I'm going to be able to get rid of that completely, because it's a really hard design challenge. Yeah. But I really want to try and at least mix things up a bit. And also you have things in RPG design with how often do you level up? How often should you be able to complete every dungeon in one go? Do you have to go back and forth between towns? Is inventory management a thing? It's all of these little logistical things that a lot of people expect from RPGs, but that probably make it a bit more grindy. But at the same time, if you take it out, is it still an RPG?
Yeah.
At least a CRPG, a Western RPG. So and that takes a lot of tweaking.
Yeah.
Really, really does. And there is no upper limit to how many features you could put into the game, because the computer can calculate anything. And that's kind of the wet dream of any tabletop RPG player who turns to computer role-playing design.
Yeah, just keep adding in more things to keep track of, trying to make that system deeper, and then you just endlessly go down that rabbit hole of a combat system that is so complicated that most people will never be able to figure out just what it is they're doing. But
exactly.
As you said, the other end of it is I've played so many RPGs where I could just put on a fast forward button and I don't even need to think about combat. And it just gets to that point of, why am I still playing this game if I'm just repeating the same thing for the next 50 hours straight?
Exactly. I try to eliminate some of that because one of the things that I've done in Skald is that I have an auto resolve button that resolves the combat turn by turn. It doesn't take all of the combat, but it resolves round per round. So when you end up in encounters where you know that your party is going to beat this encounter, you can just blast through it very quickly. And I think that's, but at the same time, there is, if you try to do that with an encounter that requires micromanagement, you're not going to, your party will die if you auto resolve it. So I try to give the player the option of sort of tuning down the grinding, at least removing the grinding and keeping the interesting bits of the combat, to put it like that. And I think it works pretty well so far. I'm very happy with the way it plays for now. But we'll see. One of the problems with role-playing games is that, they can go in the hundreds of hours, or at least in the tens. And how do you play test something as complex as a role-playing game as thoroughly as you should? At least,
Yep.
That's not an easy logistical challenge for a small dev team.
Yep. And as we were saying earlier, with kind of development for Skald, like, you've been working on this game for at least 2 years now, and it's very easy. I know many developers have struggled with this. Again, that mindset of just adding more and more and more to a project, and all of a sudden you're just ballooning your scope out of proportion. And especially when, as you said, RPG design, because it is so abstracted, it becomes very easy in a sense to add more content to it. If my story is made up of 10 quests, I could add 15 more quests on top of that.
Exactly. And Richard Garriott has a very good quote, which is pretty famous in CRPG design, at least, which is that, or it's not a quote, but a sort of like a design principle that he had adhered to, which was that he made the engine first, and then he told the story that the engine would allow him to tell. And I think that's that's definitely a way of sort of limiting to yourself, because the dangerous part is when you keep modifying the engine to suit the story you're trying to tell, because that really never ends. You'll end up far down the rabbit hole. At some point, you have to lock the engine and say, "This is the engine. What kind of story does it allow me to tell?" And I'm nearing a point where I'm at that point now, and I've been very cognizant of it, but that can really, really take you off the rails if you're not careful with it.
Yep. And so many developers, especially like many first timers, will go that route of just constantly tweaking, constantly trying to add things to it, and you just basically just end up in a circle of, I add something new, it breaks the engine, let me fix that, but now I want to add something else new, and it just never ends. And like we've said over the course of this cast and on many of our previous ones, it's very important as a developer to be able to understand and lock down what you want your game to be. And in some sense, I think this is one of the reasons why modern retro is so appealing to developers, because it kind of decides, or it kind of makes a lot of the decisions of your game right away. If I want to make a 2D Mario platformer, well, I don't need to worry about, a morality system or, RNG on top of that. But
exactly.
But like we've said, like, it's so easy to just fall into that rabbit hole of just adding more and more to this game and not really comprehending, A, if it's actually making my game better, or B, do people actually want this in this title?
Yeah, there's this design principle, of identify a problem and then create a solution for it, and then remove components from the solution until you have the absolutely smallest product that can still solve your problem, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that's really true for game design as well. And I would say if there are aspiring game developers listening to this is really, because this is what will sink your first 5 projects at least.
Yeah.
Feature creep, it will eat your projects for breakfast.
Yep.
And I think just having a strong idea when you start a project, what am I trying to accomplish, making some design pillars, and then going to the engine and make an engine that will allow you to fulfill that, and then lock down the engine and then see, okay, the engine and tell the story within the constraints. Give yourself constraints constantly and design within those constraints. It makes it so much easier to finish the product. If you don't do that, you'll never finish the game. I can promise you that.
Yeah. And it's the same thing with establishing what your core gameplay loop is going to be for many action-based games. That if you don't know what people are going to be doing in your title, nothing else is going to save your game if your core gameplay is poor. Doesn't matter, what graphics engine you have, what your story is. If your game is legitimately not well designed or not that interesting to play, nothing else is going to save it.
Well, that's true. That's true. And there's also this thing that if your game doesn't ship, even get to experience that it's not really very interesting to play. So, just keep your eye on the target and make the game shippable. Just finish the game, and you don't finish the game by bloating it. It's yeah.
And let me do a quick time check here. We're still good. There is one question that I wanted to ask you on the stream, Al. This is one of the things that we talked about, on our Twitter message. But about why is there a modern retro market? And because I think this is a very fascinating question. It's one I don't think we really have too many discussions about. Like, as we've said, this past decade, we have seen a lot of developers reach into the past in terms of making games. And again, I'm sure there are a few cynics watching or out there who are thinking, why aren't these developers just make a game that looks like something of today? Why not? If you're making a 2D platformer, why should you, or why are you thinking about using pixel art when you can just use a basic 3D engine, or let me use that air quotes, basic 3D engine?
Yeah.
And again, like, I'm sure people have asked you, like, why are you making a game that looks like something from the Commodore 64 when you have all these other options available? And again, this even goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the AAA market. With AAA developers, working on new genres or, expanding things on that front, why go, 15, 20, 30 years into the past to make your own game?
I would say that, the first part of the answer, because this is a very complex question, I think, and it has a lot of answers. It has lots of different answers for different people, I think. But the first obvious thing is nostalgia, and that's not really very interesting. So I don't think we should spend a lot of it's a given. So we shouldn't spend a lot of time talking about it. I think it's fine making games based on nostalgia, but that's just sort of scratching the surface. I think another really important discussion is the one we've had earlier, where for many of these games, there's gold in them hills, and players never abandoned these genres. The publishers did, because they wanted to keep up with the trends in technology, graphics in particular, I think. So because that becomes the question of, why do you still play chess? 1,000-year-old game, but people still play it because it's fun to play. And a retro style or old school games are still fun to play. Question of, but why don't you just take the same game loop and apply modern graphics to it, for instance? Well, the thing is that making a pixelated game, I'm not saying it's easier, but for me at least, it's been much more manageable to work in this medium than it would be to work in 3D, because I don't particularly enjoy working with 3D as a technical concept. I can't do any 3D art myself. I prefer to have a rasterized table of graphics. I want to work within a Cartesian coordinate system, and plug pixels. That's how my brain understands what I see on a computer screen. So for me, it's sort of, I couldn't have done this in any other way, I think. and that's genuine for me. And that goes, and then comes back to, okay, but why did you do the Commodore 64 palette? Well, because it made the game manageable for one person to make a game that's going to be pretty big. This game would have been brought to its knees instantly if I had went with 256 colors on 32 by 32 tiles. No way I could have finished it. So there's a lot of answers to that question, I think, and because I've heard the sort of pandering to nostalgia argument, and that this is sort of kind of an exploitation thing, but I think there's a lot more to why people make retro games than that. Really, really is.
Yeah. And I like Janšvik's comment in chat about going back to retro to fix older games in terms of, again, like some of the more annoying design issues, or even just some of the limitations in terms of technology back in the day. Like a really good example that, at least for action-based games, was that the vast majority of NES, even many of the SNES titles, had no internal saving. Back then, the idea of a battery backup was considered a luxury item. I mean, we really didn't see until, I want to say, I think PlayStation 3 era, and even, we could even argue the Xbox as well, when internal saving became a standard feature on those platforms. And again, like, that kind of stuff didn't really help anyone back in the day. And you're now...
That's true.
Yep.
Just imagine, just think about how long sort of the coin-op arcane model influenced game design, how games were kind of made to be infuriatingly difficult, and even long after it became, even long after it was a good idea, it was still part of the design, to be sort of have this adversarial thing between the game designer and the player, with making the games difficult to finish, And so I really think that, going back and fix old games, or going back and reinventing old genres in sort of a modern light, kind of like Mark was talking about, because you can't really, I mean, of course, an RPG is an RPG, but an RPG from 1990s, it's almost difficult to compare it to a modern RPGs in some ways. You can't just say that, okay, if you liked this RPG in the 1990s, you're going to love this game 30 years later, because it's two different beasts. And then I think it's interesting to go back and take that old game and see, okay, how can we make that game, how can we sort of give it an extreme makeover with all the modern tools we have today, and still make it appeal to the people who loved it back then. That's a really, really interesting idea, and I think it's a nice way of looking at games. It's kind of reuse in game design.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the more fascinating aspects of it. Like, I wrote about this in my second book on platforming, that just as you said earlier, that these games didn't fall out of popularity because they were bad. They fell out because publishers just stopped trying to make them. They wanted to keep chasing what was new. And we can see that in every decade of the game industry. The 90s were pretty much all platformers on the consoles. Wherever a game was going to come out was going to probably be in a platformer form. In the thousands, that shifted to the open world, GTA model. Then that shifted to first-person shooters. And now we're kind of in the battle royale phase of things. But unlike other markets where, when something becomes older or is no longer in favor, that it just goes away, we now have, as you were saying, as we were talking about in chat, like, the independent scene has really picked things up because they're able to make those games. Again, like, you're not going to see Activision make a RPG using Commodore 64 graphics anytime soon.
No, that's true. I hope not.
No.
Me out of business. But and that's also another interesting aspect, because when I was out running today, I was listening to your podcast, or to your episode about the loot boxes and the new legislature on loot boxes, and you were talking about how there's absolutely this resistance to a lot of these pay-to-win in-app purchases, a lot of what some people perceive as predatory business strategies in games. And I also think that sort of this retro revival in games, it's also about sort of reclaiming some of what's gaming to us, if you understand.
Yeah.
This is gaming the way I remember it and how I want it to be. There's definitely an aspect of that, an aspect of sort of the pendulum swinging the other way, or the market somehow reacting to to fatigue from some of what some of us consider to be more predatory business practices. I think for me that's absolutely part of it as well. I want a game that isn't sort of muddled up with this with the market that I don't really like, if you understand what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
The way of making a stand or a statement, in a way.
Yeah. And like we've said, like being able to work with these retro constraints does free you up to focus more on the design and the storytelling. And it
Mm.
does get, as anyone knows who's programmed a game, like any kind of graphical update or again 2D to 3D, that is an enormous amount of work on your title. And like going back to what we were saying a few minutes ago regarding, locking down your game, you really have to lock down especially your art and assets very early on. Like nobody wants to get like a halfway or even just a quarter way through your game or through development and say, you know what? Let's switch to a watercolor aesthetic for our game now. I'm sure it will be very easy to do that.
Yeah, watercolor aesthetic especially.
Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, we are getting close to 2 hours. So I guess we could touch very quickly on the Kickstarter. And again, now, if you're free in the future, we can always have you on for a follow up cast about the game and
Sure,
what's going on.
sure.
I guess before we quickly touch on the Kickstarter, I know we've kind of went in and around all over the place in terms of talking about Skald and RPG design. Are there
Uh,
any aspects you were thinking about or any topics that we didn't touch on with the game that you like to bring up?
I'm just going to put it out there as well, because as I said earlier, I've been having a pretty transparent development
Mm-hmm.
process so far, and I think that's also this. There's so many people who it goes into this thing with Kickstarter. Kickstarter is consumer trust in Kickstarter. It fluctuates
Mm-hmm.
wildly depending on projects that fail. So for me, I felt that it was important to have a very transparent development process and to interact very closely with my fans. And I'm really happy I did. I don't think it's easy to pull off, and it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of careful consideration in the way you communicate with people. But it's sort of become this mantra in my head that it's transparency as a service, and that also goes to say that that's not really a given anymore in a lot of development, not even in the indie scene sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
especially when Kickstarters are involved, because there have been a few pretty ugly examples
Yeah.
of games, even really indie games like mine, that's gone just completely off the radar, and the money's gone, when you
Yeah.
realize that the game is probably not being made. And
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of been a strategy I've followed that's worked really well for me, also because it's given me a lot more eyes on the game. So I would just like to say thank you to all the people who have been following development and offering feedback and playing the demo, and I really, really appreciate it. People have been so constructive, and a lot of my followers, they have a lot of experience with CRPGs, much more than I do even.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been invaluable to me, really, really.
Mm-hmm.
So big thanks to all my fans.
Yep. And like we've said, like Kickstarter, like we keep coming with these topics that we have like 2 to 3 hours on this
Yeah, yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
And like Kickstarter itself has definitely become a very major element for some of the developers we've seen, and it takes a lot of work. I think a lot more than what people would expect to get these projects going. As you said, like there are a lot of people who have been burned by Kickstarters. The money disappears, the game never gets released, or the game gets released and it's missing everything that was promised. And
Yeah.
you have to be really careful when you are taking money for something that is not even anywhere close to being finished yet,
Yeah.
and there's just so much that gets into that. But one thing that I wanted to ask you about the Kickstarter, and it's a question I always like to ask developers when they come on. How long did you spend planning it out before you actually officially posted it?
Mm, I would say that I spent I had the Kickstarter. I realized for some reason, even though Kickstarters had been falling out of favor, actually, when I started with Skald, not when I launched, but when I started the project, in the back of my head, I always knew that I really, really wanted to do a Kickstarter. Partially just to have done a Kickstarter, to sort of have the experience and to test the concept, but also because I realized that for Skald, it would be really, really kind of the community building I would be able to do by doing a Kickstarter would be really important for me. So even though, so in my mind, I really started to sort of gravitate towards that about a year before I launched.
Okay.
And I would say 6 months before I launched, I sort of went into production mode with sort of setting a date, and then okay, I know that I'm going to launch in May, and then I started sort of testing the waters with the followers I had on social media and on other arenas where I was sort of trying to get an impression of what is the project these people would like to see on Kickstarter. Is there any changes I could do to the project to make it more appealing to the Kickstarter crowd? And definitely going with the graphical look that I did, and sort of going all in on the like hardcore retro RPG niche.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big part of it because I identified a big audience there. And then maybe like a written out business strategy for doing it. Pretty much all of the social media I was doing and the way I was presenting the game was done with the Kickstarter in mind. And then I would say maybe 6 weeks before Kickstarter launched, I went into crunch mode, and particularly the 4 weeks before the Kickstarter were pretty intense with preparing everything, because I did everything myself for the Kickstarter, and I don't really recommend it, but because you have to be really, really well disciplined, and there's 1,000 things that could go wrong. And I would have to say that I would actually prefer to have postponed my Kickstarter 2 months, but there is something to do with the timing in regards to, for instance, the summer months, which are usually not as good for kickstarting. So I had to go when I did, even though I wasn't completely finished. And I spent a lot of time doing it, a lot of planning, and you have to think about things that you don't normally think about, and have to learn things that you didn't know already. So if you're considering doing a Kickstarter, it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of planning, and probably, I would say statistically, you would probably fail, at least the first time. And so it takes a lot of research. It takes a lot of network building. It does. It's a really, really, and also when it's going on, it's pretty intense. I was pretty red-eyed when I was finished with the Kickstarter, to be honest.
Yep.
But it was well. Can't complain.
Yep. And again, like, it's one of those things where so many people tried jumping onto it without understanding what it takes to actually make these things work, and it failed. And it can be very rough in terms of actually playing things out. So, as you were describing, I was just looking through the page itself, and I guess a few things I wanted to just like touch on. I guess one thing, I noticed that you have exclusive content, I think, for Kickstarter backers, and I've seen that be a double-edged sword for other Kickstarter-based games in the past. So I just wanted to ask you, like, what was the decision to have that? Like, what were your thoughts on having that as a reward or an incentive?
It is a double-edged sword, and I think both in the terms that you risk having to end up making content that very few people gets to see, and that's never really a good design decision. It's a very poor use of resources, and also there's always the chance that some people will be pretty ticked that you're walling off content. Probably, the way I conceive of it, probably I will holding content indefinitely. So I'll probably release the extra content at the release date, or pretty soon after the release date, for backers, and then it will probably be available as a DLC sometimes down the line, I would say, or in like a bundled in with some more DLC content down the line,
Yeah.
perhaps. So, but it's the reward structure is complicated, and I think that's another area where you usually get a lot of rope to hang yourself with, because
Yeah.
it's so easy to overcommit or overpromise and then
Oh
find that it's
yes.
really difficult to deliver. Also, the thing with physical rewards and shipping,
Yep.
that's a pretty that's a minefield. So I would have to say I was the way I targeted the price range, or like the target, not the price range, but the target sum for the Kickstarter. It was such that if I had gotten the sum I asked for, but nothing more, if I had gotten 100% completion, but not 260%, it would have been a pretty that oh man, that would have been a pretty big letdown. Because there's also this strategy that the less you ask for, the sooner you will reach
Mm-hmm.
100% funding, and the more money you'll get flowing in. Funding the project with an artificially too low amount of money. So that's really kind of a tactical gamble you have to think
Yeah.
through. And it worked very well for me, but it could have just as easily backfired.
Yep. And you also have to be careful, as you said, like if you say to people, I can make this game with $50,000, and let's say and that's your goal, but then you realize, wait, I actually need $150,000 for it. You are then contractor. You are on the I forget the term there. You are committed, essentially, I should say, to then making that game with a budget that you probably think is not even feasible.
Absolutely. And so many people burn themselves doing that. Or I don't know that if many people, but there's been sufficient amount of stories of people ending up like that, that you see that it's eroded the confidence that people have had in Kickstarters. I would have to say that I think reasons why I succeeded is that with Nox Arcade went the month before me.
Mm-hmm.
I think both me and Mark have the same idea that a rising tide lifts all boats in the indie game industry. So because we could have just as easily been competitors, because we really compete for at least part of the same market. But I think we both, without saying it in so many words, I think we both agreed that we could really benefit from each other's help and from doing social media together. So we had a lot of synergies from each other's campaigns, and Mark and his team ran a really successful campaign. And honestly, I think that helped my campaign. I would have gotten less money if they hadn't gone before me, because people became enthusiastic about this kind of game. It's a very well suited genre for Kickstarters. I mean, a lot of the people who like my kind of game, they're people who hang around on Kickstarters looking for the back. And even if they backed Mark's project in May, that didn't keep them from backing my project in June. It just made them more hungry for more of the same, I think. So I was very lucky with having them go the month before me, actually. And but also I think it was a strategy both for me and Mark to collegial relationship during this process. And I think you don't see that a lot of the time. Some people are very willing to
Yeah.
set each other down the river and stab each other in the back in this business. Surprisingly, many people. But just be professional and be nice to people and be an asset to people around you, and people will really flock to your project. And that's also, I think, the thing with Kickstarter, because a lot of people that back me are also game developers, and they don't really back the game necessarily. They back the dream that a single developer can kickstart a game and make it, even in this economy, in air quotes. And those people, they really notice if you're professional, if you treat people okay. I think that's it's so underrated to have the soft people skills in this business.
Yep. And like I always say with game wisdom, that my reputation is it for me. Like if I lose it, I can't get it back. Like I need people to know that I'm professional, that I know what I'm talking about. And as you said, be courteous, be respectful. And it
Yeah,
does help when it comes to getting people on your side who legitimately want to see you succeed.
absolutely.
Hmm.
And I think also, it's there is an untapped potential in helping each other, just sharing. And that's also been my strategy on Twitter. I don't have a huge Twitter following, but the people I have are they're good people and they really help me. But the reason why that is, I think, is that you should just see something you call them out, tell them that you like
Hmm.
it, share it on your Discord, just go the extra. It's not even an extra mile, it's an extra centimeter. It takes 5 seconds, and it really helps for solo developers to get that little push. And I think that really buys you just so much goodwill, and people will remember that for years to come.
Hmm.
I think it can't be underestimated.
Hmm. And especially as we've said, when it comes to the idea of Kickstarter as well, that you were built like how long? I'm assuming like right from the get go with Skull, like you were reaching out and trying to build a community around the game.
Yeah.
Let me see.
I'm sorry. Was that a question? I'm sorry. I was reading in the chat. Was that a question? I didn't get it.
I was just saying like about how much time you spent building a community around Skull and getting people to learn and know it existed out there.
I have to say I definitely spent some time doing that, and I had a lot of and I think that's very that it's not exclusive to Skald, but that was it kind of comes with the genre that I could spend a lot of time going into relatively small communities,
Hmm.
like uh, like a Facebook group for Ultima fans, or a Reddit post for Magic Candle fans, and but still, even if I got only a handful of followers from there, they're the kind of people that will really go the mile, and who will back the Kickstarter at a high level, who will engage with the product during alpha testing and give you really good feedback. So for me, they've been really invaluable, and it's worked very well for me, I would have to say, so far. I wouldn't say I have a big following, but the people I have are really committed. And I think that in the end, when the game finally goes up on more public platforms, it goes up on Steam, it
Hmm.
goes on the Google Play Store, probably this will give me some reach, because those are people who I know will promote the game. Yeah, and so forth. And so, at least for now, it's been a very good community to have, I think. But I spent a lot of time doing it, and targeting certain groups where I knew that, okay, this group will have people who's interested in my games.
Hmm.
I had very little impact in doing mass marketing,
Yeah.
for instance, on Twitter, Facebook. That didn't really get me anything.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Yep. And yeah, you can only do so much when you're a solo person like this. And it's important to be able to focus on your strengths and being able to get the work done. So let me see here. I think we are just about there in terms of time. There's one last thing I wanted to ask you about with the Kickstarter, and then we'll kind of go into our wrap up. For people watching us live right now, there's going to be officially last call for questions. So if you have any, please get them in now, as we will be ending things in probably the next 5 to 10 minutes. But the part that I want to ask you on the Kickstarter, again, keeping with this theme of knowing what you can do and also, figuring out what your goal is for the game, I wanted to ask you about your approach to the stretch goals. So I was
yeah,
looking at the list. So you of course have a basic one, full color manual, things like that. And then we
yeah.
have stuff like additional areas, a new class. I think you hit one for here it is, a procedurally generated murder dungeon, and that's a quote from the Kickstarter itself.
Yeah, I know.
So I just wanted to ask you, like, what was like how did you approach stretch goals for a project like this? Because again, as we've said, it would be very easy to just have like a list of 50 different stretch goals for your game.
Yeah, I think what I did, because stretch goals are difficult because you could set them all ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
That's not necessarily, I mean, that can definitely work, but it didn't work as well for me. So I had to do a combination of listening to feedback from backers whilst sort of trying to combine that. I gave them a lot of closed choices, you know. I would sort of probe into, okay, how, you know, what should the next thing be? Is it an extra area, or is it an extra class, or is it a cosmetic thing like full color manual or things like that, and trying to be sensitive to feedback from the players whilst keeping it within things that I felt comfortable committing to, things that I would probably have included in the game after all. If I had, I wouldn't say unlimited amount of money, but if I had more money down the line, it would sort of be a natural extrapolation of the way the game was going already. For instance, making it a 3-act game instead of just setting it all on one island, the one area in the game world, and things like that. So it's I think what you have to keep in mind all the time while setting stretch goals is just be cognizant of the risk and think, how is this going to sink my project? Is this something that's going to ruin my project? Think about that more than, is this an interesting, because there's always, it's
Yeah.
easy to find interesting stretch goals, but it's the risk that you have to consider. How can I minimize my risk?
Mm-hmm. And as you said earlier, when it comes to physical goods as well, you can go insane with come up with all crazy ideas for it, and then that can completely kill your project when you realize again the logistics of shipping them around the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you have to put big margins in there to make sure that that the margins fall on your side, and then just add 20% to the cost on top of that, even just when you do your budgeting for shipping, because it will become that expensive.
Oh
One thing I
yes.
want to add with the stretch goals, in case someone is considering to do a Kickstarter, it's extremely important that you, in a tasteful way, the integrity of each backer tier. If you use a stretch goal to undermine one of the tiers, you will have made people really, really angry with you. For instance, if you say that people on this tier, they get the full color manual, but then you add as a stretch goal, okay, now everyone gets the full color manual. You will have people, and it's easy to do that. It's
Yeah.
easy to not think about that, but you will make people really, really angry if you do that. That's the thing that will turn people off your project completely. It's just this. People pay for the exclusivity. They do actually, and if you undermine that somehow, then why should they have paid more? You know,
Yeah.
and you should be really, really careful with that.
Mm-hmm.
And we avoided all those traps with the Kickstarter, I think. So I'm
Yeah.
very happy with that.
And as we said earlier, like when it comes to setting up these goals and the rewards around them, that you are collecting money from people for something that is nowhere near close to being finished. And if they start, if anyone gets even a whiff of, anything being underhanded or under the table like that, that can easily turn your entire fan base against you.
Absolutely. And also, that's another thing that will really undermine the confidence in you is, don't air your grievances with your fans. If you're really tired, if you're really exhausted, your Discord channel is not the place to air that. If you're frustrated with Kickstarter or with taxation,
Mm-hmm.
just keep it off the table. It's not for your fans to hear. Treat them like your children in that sense, you know. It's just, yeah, I would have to say. But people do that also, and I think that really, for me at least, that's something that really, really turns me off the project. It makes me
Yeah.
sure that, okay, this developer is not going to go the line if they're already starting to crack in public like this. And you can't do it. Don't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that is. Again, we could easily switch any one of these other topics, but I know that you probably have to get going in a few minutes. I think you said. I think you said like 2 hours around like your comfortable time.
It's midnight in Norway now,
Yeah.
and I work tomorrow, so this is
Yeah.
pretty good
So
wrap.
I don't want you to be up all night long talking. Although I'm sure the audience wouldn't mind that. Just us being on for another 3-4 hours. But Al, it's been a great time having you on. To wrap things up for the cast, for people watching, Do you have any tentative dates for when Skald will be out?
I'm hoping June or July 2020. Next summer is the tentative release date.
Okay.
And before we do that, we're probably, as we start ordering up the physical boxes, we're probably also going to do an extra round of pre-orders for people who didn't get to follow the Kickstarter, but you still want like a physical product or something like that. So I would really just recommend people keep their eyes open. Follow me on Twitter, and if you want to play the demo, join us on Discord, and I'll give you a demo key as well, and you can engage with us in the development. You don't have to be a backer to do that either. Would love to have you.
Great. And you already mentioned this in various parts of the cast, but to clarify for this point, in terms of platforms, what platforms will Skald be on?
Well, the platforms we've committed to for the Kickstarter is PC, Mac, and Linux, with a big question mark on the Linux. I don't think we promised it on the Kickstarter, but it's conceivable that we will be able to ship to Linux operating systems as well. And then the game is going to because it's unless the game flops completely, I'm also going to port it to handheld devices, but that is stage 2. The release date next summer is for the desktop devices.
Okay. And let me see, what was the other question? So people can check out the demo now. Oh, and I guess a big one. You already mentioned your Twitter. Are there any other social media people can find you at, or you want them to know about for Skald?
Oh, for now, I try to concentrate my social media on Twitter. I assume we'll add the details in the show notes or something like that. But on Twitter, I'm at SkaldRPG. Devlog is also skaldrpg.com, and the Discord invite will be in the show notes. You can join us there for all things Skald related.
For sure. All right. So I guess with that, my final question for you for the evening is, do you have anything you would like to say to the fans watch, or anything to kind of wrap the cast up with?
Oh, just feel free to engage with the project. I really love talking to the fans, and I'm passionate about CRPGs, and I would love to hear your opinion. So please reach out. That's all I have to. Yeah.
What I need to do is get like you, Mark, I think one other developer on, like who's working on like old school games, and we'll just have like a CRPG roundtable cast at some point.
I would love that. That's the best idea I've heard all week. That would be amazing.
All right, maybe I'll send Mark another message when his cast is about up, and we'll see if we can get something together like that.
Let's see about that. Good idea.
All right, so I think with that, we are going to end things for tonight. And for people watching us live right now, this Saturday, that is I should know these days by now, that will be the 28th. On our Indie Spotlight stream, I will be also checking out Skald then, as Al did send me a demo key for that, so I'll be able to give my thoughts on it then. And again, if you are new, be sure to check out the Discord and Patreon link down below. But again, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you this evening. Best of luck with Skald. And yep, when you're free in the future, it'll be great to have you back on.
Thank you so much. I really hope to talk to you again.
Not a problem. And for people watching us, if you are working on your own game or just want to talk design, we are always looking for new guests for our live and recorded casts. Be sure, feel free to send me a message. You can find me on Twitter at GWBicer, or again, anywhere here. But I'll be back later tonight for our regular game stream, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. Until our next chat, have a great night, everybody.